Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal, and today we are continuing our conversation about employee selection. And this is chapter 7 in your textbook, so it's technically selection part 2. And in this video, we are going to talk specifically about recruitment strategies and issues of validity. This chapter is organized around strategic issues in the selection process. Strategic issues include first, attracting the best talent. So this happens through recruitment strategies that organizations use. It also includes ensuring that your predictors are valid, fair, and legally defensible. It includes administering multiple predictors through selection methods and combining predictor data to make the best hiring decisions. So this is sort of a broad snapshot of the selection process within organizations. So first, recruitment, then making sure that the predictors that you're using to choose who to select in the organization are valid, are fair, and legally defensible. Then administering those predictors like interviews or tests or whatever you're using, and then combining the different predictors that you've selected for your procedures in order to make the best hiring decisions. So you will see this graphic throughout the presentation in the videos for this chapter. And what this is showing you is a snapshot of the process that I just walked through, where you're choosing those recruitment strategies to try to get the most possible qualified candidates to apply for the job. Then you're ensuring that your predictors are valid so that you can hire the best possible employees. You're ensuring that those predictors are also legally defensible and fair and not discriminatory. Then you would administer those predictors using your selection methods, and you would use that data that you get from those to make decisions about who to hire. And finally, you also consider how the applicants experience the hiring process, and we call this applicant reactions. So we're going to start on the left side here and talk about recruitment first. Organizations spend on average $3,300 per hire on recruiting. And this is because they want to try to get the best possible people for the job. Obviously, this will depend on the job, so they're going to spend more money to recruit for jobs that are higher level and that require more expertise, and maybe less money for recruitment of entry-level positions, but still, it is a big investment that companies make. And the goal with their spending their money on recruitment is to increase the number of applicants that apply for the job, and not just the number of applicants, but increasing the quality of applicants. So hoping to get more qualified applicants to apply for the job. And to increase and maintain workforce diversity. So we still have a lot of strides to make in the United States to try to get our workforce to adequately represent what we see in the population in terms of demographics. So if recruitment is successful, we're making sure that we have received a variety of diverse applications from different groups of individuals. In terms of increasing the number of applicants, this graphic shows you what I mean by that. So on the left-hand side, if a company attracts candidates, 30 candidates to apply for a position and go through a selection process to hire 10, that is one way to do it. But it's even better if they can attract more candidates, say 100 candidates to choose from, and they still will end up hiring 10, but they have more to choose from, which means that they can increase their chances of finding better candidates for the job. There are many ways to recruit candidates to apply for positions. These include career websites, social networking sites. LinkedIn is a huge one these days. So if you are going to be looking for a job pretty soon, I would highly recommend that you create a profile on LinkedIn and start networking. So start building your network because people end up making connections on that site, and they can learn information that is career related, and it may just help find a job. Employee referral programs are another method for recruitment. And this is referring to when existing employees refer a friend or someone they know to apply for a job within their organization. And sometimes there are even bonuses that are given to current workers who successfully recruit people to apply and who are selected for the job. There are also career fairs. And some considerations as to which methods to use to recruit include cost and the quality of applicants, so not just increasing the number, but making sure that the company is getting an increase in quality applicants, and the diversity of the applicant pool. So, for example, I was part of a hiring committee to select a new faculty member in the psychology department last year. And we really wanted to increase the number of applications that we received from individuals who do not primarily identify as white. So we reached out and recruited from several different avenues or websites and groups, clubs, groups within the Society for IO Psychology that we knew that individuals of color would be a part of. And we also reached out to our personal networks, and we sent a message hoping that we would get increased applications for the position through those methods. Okay, so we're back to this graphic to show that we are moving on to the step where we ensure that predictors are valid in order to make sure that we can hire the best employees. We went over validity in the last video, and so this is another review of that. Face validity is referring to the extent to which an applicant feels that the questions that they're being asked or the method that's being used to select them is fair and a valid method for that job. So is it job related? You could imagine that work samples tend to have high levels of face validity. So if you remember from last chapter, work samples are when applicants complete a piece of work that they would actually be expected to do on the job. For instance, if an organization is hiring a software developer, they may ask him or her to provide some code to solve a problem. So face validity has to do with how much the selection method appears to be valid. Content validity is referring to the degree to which the selection method covers all of the important domains on the job. So if the job involves a lot of different aspects, the selection method should make sure that it's covering all of those aspects. And typically we assess content validity through the use of SMEs or subject matter experts. Construct validity is referring to the degree to which a measure that you're using during the selection process, so for instance a test, how much does that actually assess the construct that you are hoping it does assess? So for example, intelligence tests are very commonly used during selection processes. And we talked about in last chapter how intelligence tests do tend to have good criterion-related validity, so around 0.4 to 0.6. However, we need to make sure that any test of intelligence that we would be using as an organization also has construct validity. So is this indeed actually a measure of intelligence? We think it's a measure of intelligence, but is it truly measuring intelligence? And in order to answer that question, we look at how that measure, scores on that measure correlate with scores on other measures that in ways that we know it should. So we look for correlations, positive and strong correlations with things that we know that it is positively and strongly correlated with. And we look for weak correlations with things that we know that it should not correlate with. Finally, criterion-related validity is referring to how much a predictor is able to predict future job performance. So in terms of the criterion-related validity of intelligence tests that I just mentioned of 0.4 to 0.6, you can think of that 0.4 to 0.6 as being a correlation coefficient. Otherwise, we can call it a validity coefficient. And it's a strong correlation. Remember that we said around 0.5 is strong. So in other words, as test scores on intelligence increase, job performance scores also tend to increase. So that's what we mean by criterion-related validity. It's the degree of relationship found between the predictor and the job performance criterion. So again, we talked about this a little bit in our last video, but we will continue to talk about it. I think that the more you hear it, the more helpful it is. And this is about the importance of validity in personnel selection. So why do we care about this so much? Number one, it is important to ensure fair access to employment opportunities that is focused on how well someone will do the job. So in other words, how much it can predict job performance, and not focused on irrelevant traits. So by irrelevant traits, I mean things like race, gender, identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, skin color, religion, or disability. So a huge part of IO psychology is ensuring that we are not letting bias against individuals come into play during selection processes. So we want to make sure that we are focusing on predictors that will actually tell us how well someone's going to do in the job and not tell us irrelevant information. Number two, there is no point to using a selection procedure with unknown or low validity. So if the selection procedure is not able to predict future job performance, there is no reason for a company to use it. And number three, predictors with high validity enable organizations to hire the best talent, those who will perform best on the job. So the higher the validity, or in other words, the stronger the predictor can predict job performance, the better the individual is likely to perform on the job. And so this would give organizations a competitive advantage. Companies want to hire the best possible workers for the job. Cross-validation is used to increase the confidence that the validity coefficient that we found in one study was accurate. So cross-validation refers to replicating a study using a different sample. So for example, if I found that intelligence test scores predicted job performance in one large organization, maybe with 1,000 workers in it, I might want to replicate that finding to make sure that it's going to hold up in other situations. So I could maybe go to another organization and also get the same data on intelligence test scores and job performance scores to make sure that my results would replicate. It's also important to know that the larger the original validation sample is that is used in that study, the more accurate the study will be. So larger sample sizes tend to produce what we call more stable results. If a sample is very small, so less than 30 individuals, in terms of calculating a correlation coefficient, it's unlikely that the results will cross-validate. There's just too much error going on. So we need to have large samples in order to make sure that our validity information is stable. That brings us to the idea of validity generalization and situational specificity. So these are big words, and what the heck does this mean? Validity generalization is referring to the assumption that a test will be valid in other jobs if it is valid for one job. So if we validate a test for an administrative assistant position in an organization, can we take that test and use it for a secretary, hiring a secretary? An administrative assistant and a secretary's duties overlap somewhat, but they might be slightly different depending on the organization. So can we assume that the validity of a test for an administrative assistant would also be valid for the job of a secretary? How about a test for police officers versus firefighters? So do you think that you could take a test that was designed for hiring police officers and also use it to hire firefighters? What about EMTs? So this is what we're getting at when we talk about validity generalization versus situational specificity. Will the test be valid for other jobs or other situations, or is it really specific depending on the actual job? So validity generalization is kind of assuming that the validity will spread or generalize to other jobs, and situational specificity is referring to the belief that just because a test was shown to be valid in one setting, that you cannot assume that it'll be valid in other settings, even if the two situations are similar. In terms of what the general verdict is, after accumulating meta-analytic evidence, IO psychologists generally agree that test validities are likely to generalize across situations as long as the jobs are similar in terms of the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are needed. However, the courts and the uniform guidelines, which I'll talk about in a moment, are in favor of a situational specificity approach, such that tests should be validated for each situation in which they are used. And we are going to get a lot more into legal implications for selection in the coming slides. But for now, you should know that there is something called the Uniform Guidelines, and this is a set of guidelines that exists for organizations to talk about how they can use selection measures in organizations and what validity evidence they need to have in order to use those selection methods. The idea behind the Uniform Guidelines is to provide equal access and equal opportunity to employment, regardless of somebody's skin color, race, ethnicity, gender, disability status, religion, and so forth.